Can you hear me there? That's better. I'm Greg Borzo, the treasurer of the Midland Authors, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to our September program. We do this thing every month, almost every month, so hope you'll join us again sometime. Midland Authors was founded in 1915 to help authors connect with authors and authors connect with readers. For more information, visit our website, midlandauthors.org, and there are brochures on the table in the foyer where the books are for sale. So please pick up a brochure there, and also while you're there, sign our email list so you can get information about all of our upcoming programs. And gee whiz, while I'm at it, if there are any authors here who are interested in joining, we do have nomination forms. Jerry, raise your hand. Talk to Jerry about that. He'll explain the process for joining. So before we go any farther, I do want to thank the Chicago Public Library for hosting tonight. And what a beautiful venue here at the Cindy Pritzker Auditorium. And you're especially welcome here tonight because it's the 150th anniversary of the Chicago Public Library. So please learn about events related to the 150th anniversary at ChiPublib, ChiPublib.org/150. There'll be events, exhibits, celebrations from now throughout the rest of the year. Just so you know, the event is being streamed on the library's YouTube and Facebook page, so it'll be available on demand afterwards. Anyone who missed the program, or if you could tell your friends about it, have them know that they can watch this presentation on Facebook. What else? Pick up a copy of the book, of course, in the foyer, and John will be signing copies down here in front after the program. We'll be happy to hear questions from everybody, but we will ask you to use the microphone so that the questions can be recorded for the benefit of all those watching the program down the road. I do want to mention, too, that this event is part of the Chicago Public Library's Voices for Justice speaker series. So do go to the website and look for more programs like this one in that speaker series. So let's get to it here. Jonathan Eig is the author of 6 books, 4 of them New York Times bestsellers. His most recent book, King, A Life, was called by the New York Times the definitive biography of Martin Luther King Jr. It went on to say that it was a book, quote, worthy of its subject. That's a tall order. Prior to this book, Eig wrote Ali, A Life, and that's been hailed as one of the best sports biographies ever. So do read that one. Following up on that book, Eig served as a senior consulting producer for the PBS series on Muhammad Ali. So I can recommend that documentary and the book to everyone. Another Eig book is Lou Gehrig, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig. This and many of his books have won major awards. I won't just go on and list them because you want to hear from him. So John lives in Chicago with his wife and children, and I also note that he's a longtime member of the Midland Authors. We've been honored to have John as a speaker before at the Midland Authors, and now we're delighted to have him back to speak about his new book. Let's welcome him.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you to the Midland Authors. As Greg said, I've been a member just about since it was founded in 1915. And I've been a patron of the Chicago Public Libraries for a good 30 years now, with my library card still, I think, an unblemished record, more or less, of returned books. So it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be talking to you about my new book. I'd like to begin by telling you the first sentence of my book, which I think I can get pretty accurately. On December 5th, 1955, a young black man became one of the founding fathers of America. He was 26 years old. The place was Montgomery, Alabama, former home of the Confederate capital of the United States, a place where there had been something like 300 lynchings in the past 50, 60 years. He became a founding father that day, I say, because he, this young man, did more to fulfill the promise that the other founding fathers had made in writing the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. They had promised that this would be a country where all men were created equal, but it had not borne out that way for hundreds of years. But this young man, who took the podium in 1955, had an idea about how that could be accomplished, how we could get closer than we ever imagined or than we'd ever come to realizing the potential of this country's democracy. His name, of course, was Martin Luther King, Jr. And at that point in Montgomery, Alabama, the majority of the people in the audience that day had not heard of him. As I said, he was 26. He was fairly new in town, and he was leading a new church, getting used to the community, when the Montgomery bus boycott arose. And at this point, on December 5th, it had not begun. Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat on the bus a day earlier, as we all know, 2 days earlier, and the community had to decide how they were going to respond. There had been talk of a boycott before, but it had never come to a fruition. The time had not been right. The characters involved had not been right. So on December 5th, thousands of people gathered at Holt Street Baptist Church, the biggest church in Montgomery, to try to decide what to do. And they needed somebody to speak to them, someone to address them. And they asked this young preacher to be the spokesman, not to be the leader of what would later be called the Montgomery Improvement Association, just to be the spokesman, just to give the speech that would help convince people to stay off the bus on Monday. Why did they choose this young man, this 26-year-old? I believe it was mostly because he was new in town, and he hadn't made too many enemies yet. He had a reputation for being a pretty fair speaker, but that was all people really knew about him. And when he stood there that day with thousands of people, he had to, let me back up a minute. He found out just an hour or so before that he had to give this speech. He had 20 minutes to prepare by the time he got home. When he got home, he walked in the door and told Coretta, I don't know what I just agreed to do. His wife, Coretta Scott King, had just given birth to their first child. And he said, I think I've been asked to lead some kind of a meeting tonight, but I don't even know what's going on. And he had 20 minutes to prepare. He went back into his study, and for the first 10 minutes, he had a panic attack. This is King at 27, just a little older than he was on the day that I'm talking about. But for the first 10 minutes, he had a panic attack, and that's how he described it. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. 10 minutes of his 20 minutes were gone. Then he jotted a few notes, rushed out the door. Ralph Abernathy picked him up and drove him to the church. Then he got to the church. They couldn't even get within 2-3 blocks because there were so many people. He fought his way in and gave a speech that I believe really defined King for the next 13 years of his career and changed the nation, changed the possibilities of what this nation could be more than anything else. He crystallized it that day because what he said was, and let's remember, King was a product of the church. He was a product of the South. He was a black man from Atlanta, the son of a preacher, the grandson of a preacher. But he'd been educated in the North as well as in the South. And he was able to find this voice that spoke to everyone. He was speaking directly to the black audience in front of him, the entirely black audience. There may have been one white newspaper reporter in the room, but thousands of Montgomery citizens who were waiting to hear his word. But his words also carried to the North, where it was broadcast, where northern reporters would write about what he said. And he had this ability to speak to both groups at the same time. He had this ability to combine the words of the Constitution with the words of the Bible in a way that was almost impossible to ignore. And what he said that day was that if we are wrong in gathering here to fight for our rights, then the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And I would encourage you to go home and listen to the tape, because Coretta sent him with a tape recorder that day. And you can hear how the crowd responded. And in that moment, this 26-year-old becomes a leader, not prepared for this, not expecting it, not looking for it, but he becomes the leader that this country needs. I wrote this book because in the 60 or so years since that moment, 70 or so years since that moment, we've turned Martin Luther King into a monument. We've turned him into a national holiday. We've turned him into a postage stamp, all honors that he richly deserves. But in the process of doing that, we've lost sight of him as a human being. And we've lost sight of just how truly radical he was, just how truly brave he was, and just how much he believed in us and our potential to be better. I wanted to write a book that would remind people that this was not a preordained outcome, that he was a person who had doubts. He was a person who chewed his fingernails. He was a person who suffered depression, who twice as an adolescent attempted suicide, who was not perfect by any means, who cheated on his wife over and over again, and yet who believed so strongly in what he was doing that he would risk his life for it. So when I began this book, and I began more than 6 years ago, with the idea that his story needed to be told again. It needed to be told more intimately, and with the common sense that there were still people alive who knew him well. And when I was researching my Muhammad Ali book, I met some of these people who knew King, and that's really what got me interested in this. I was sitting with Dick Gregory and talking to him about Ali, and he began mentioning Martin Luther King. I was sitting with Harry Belafonte, and he began talking about Martin Luther King, and that's when I realized that there was a closing window of opportunity to write a book about King with interviews from the people who knew him. So the very first thing I did was to travel the country and interview people like Belafonte. I was fortunate to begin before COVID started so that I could go to their homes and go to their churches. People like Reverend Jesse Jackson here in Chicago, Juanita Abernathy, the wife of Ralph Abernathy. And I was blessed and recognized that this was going to be one of the great blessings of my life, to meet these people and to talk to them while there was still time. And one of the really great lucky breaks that I had was when COVID hit. I had already met most of them in person, and now we were all stuck at home. And I was able to call them on the phone almost every day sometimes. June Dobbs Butts, King's childhood friend, I called her every day for weeks at a time. She was in a nursing home, and no one could visit her for a long time. Reverend James Lawson in Los Angeles, I scheduled a weekly call with him for months where I just said, I want to go to Lawson University. Please teach me everything that you can about the civil rights movement if you have nothing else to do. And he graced me with his time. And the same thing with many of the scholars. And I have to say that, I write this book standing on the shoulders of so many people who came before me, but I was able to reach some of the scholars who've been studying King all their lives and ask them for help. And at the same time, I began doing archival research. And I began looking into, I want to tell you about 3 of the big archival discoveries I made and how they shape our vision of King and how they shape the story that I wrote. The first big discovery that I made, this is King's family. His mom, Alberta, his dad, Martin Luther King Sr., standing in the middle, his grandmother, and then King is on your right, his sister Christine in the middle, and his brother A.D. on the left. Martin Luther King Sr. was born into sharecropping. His father and mother were born in Martin Luther King Sr.'s mother and father were born into slavery. And Martin Luther King Sr., at the age of 12 or 13, decided to leave the farm in Stockbridge, Georgia, because he had seen what it had done to his father, turned his father into a raging, angry alcoholic. His mother had kept the faith. His mother was still a believer in God, still went to church every Sunday, but Martin Luther King Sr., was Mike King, as he was known at the time, couldn't take it anymore. He tied his only pair of shoes over his shoulders and started walking from Stockbridge to Atlanta, determined to make a new life for himself, went to work on the railroads, began teaching himself to read and write, and became a preacher. And soon enough, when he was about 20 years old, he met Alberta Williams, who was the daughter of a prominent preacher in Atlanta, the preacher at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and declared he was going to marry her. So I was very fortunate to find Daddy King's unpublished autobiography. I'm the first writer to discover this. In fact, the King family didn't know it existed until I found it. And this biography tells us so much about this man, this true American hero, who had the courage with nothing really to guide him, with no example before him of how this could be done, to leave Atlanta, to leave Stockbridge, move to Atlanta, remake himself, and begin to raise a family that he was determined would change the world. Now, that doesn't mean he expected his son to become a Nobel Prize winner, but he expected all of his children to fight for justice, to fight for the concept that was contained in the Bible but wasn't being carried out, that God creates all of us in his own image. The idea that the Bible and American society were not juxtaposed, that there was this gigantic conflict, was something that many black Christians believed had to be resolved, and it was part of their faith. That it wasn't enough just to pray for your own benefit, to pray for health, to pray for fortune. We had to pray and we had to work to change American society, to make it fair, to make it live up to the words, to bring it into line with what we were praying for and the Bible that we were reading. And that's the concept that Martin Luther King Jr. and A.D. and Christine grew up with, that they had a responsibility to do that. So that by the time Martin Luther King is 15 years old, he's applying to Morehouse College. And he's set his sights on a career. He's not sure at first whether he wants to follow his father's footsteps. He, like a lot of us, is bucking the paternal, the family business. He thinks maybe he'll be a lawyer or a doctor. But when he does finally give in and become a preacher, he's determined that he's going to fight for civil rights. He goes to Boston University to get his doctorate. First he goes to Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, then Boston University. And he tells people, everyone he meets, especially the girls, this is one of his lines of flirting, that I'm going to kill Jim Crow. Not that I'm going to help Jim Crow, I am going to kill Jim Crow. This is a young man with a lot of confidence. And it's in Boston that he meets Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott, at the time, was a small-town girl from Marion, Alabama, but she had been to Antioch College, an integrated school in Ohio. And she was in Boston studying to become a concert singer at the New England Conservatory of Music. And King, I should point out, by this time was quite well established as a ladies' man. He had a reputation, even in junior high and high school. He had this great, as a young member of the church, he would go to these church dances, and he would be sort of the chaperone. He would make sure the boys and girls weren't dancing too closely. But then when he went to break it up, he would always lead the girl away and take her off and talk to her. He was smooth. And I talked to some of the girls he dated in Boston, and they said, first of all, they all said he was short, much shorter than they expected, but he had a car, and he was smooth. And when he met Coretta, he was dating other women at the time, but he told Coretta on the first date, you're the one I'm going to marry. You're the one I've been looking for all this time. And you have to ask yourself why. And one of the ways I discovered why was that Coretta, right after her husband's death, started recording audio tapes to begin working on her memoir. And I found those audio tapes. Again, the King family, the King Archive at Stanford and the King Center in Atlanta didn't have these tapes. They were in the possession of the ghostwriter who worked with Coretta on her manuscript. And again, I know I'm the first book to have access to, book writer to have access to those tapes. But what you hear on those tapes is that Coretta, from day one, from the first date, saw herself as a partner, so that when King said, I'm going to kill Jim Crow, Coretta said, I'm going to do the same thing. We can do it together. And King was deeply attracted to her, not just because she was intelligent and beautiful and talented, but because she had more experience at that point as an activist. She, at Antioch, had been involved in student protests. She'd gone to the Progressive Party's National Convention in Philadelphia. She was reading books that he hadn't heard of yet. And I think he was deeply attracted to that. And then, of course, the irony is that when they get married, King tells her, your job is to raise the children. And this is one of the flaws of King, and we'll talk about some of the others later. But King had a problem recognizing the contributions, the potential contributions of women in the movement, and it began with his wife. So as they move on and as they get married, King very quickly, soon into their marriage, becomes the star of the Montgomery bus boycott. And there's this movement to try to recruit him, to take this concept nationally, to see how we can replicate the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. And this picture is taken in front of the Alabama State Capitol. Dexter Avenue Church, if you've been there, I'm sure some of you have, is just across the street from the state capitol. King's career we think of it as being fairly short and meteoric. We think of him going from Montgomery to Birmingham to Selma to the March on Washington. But that's not what happened. After Montgomery, he really stumbled. There were many people, including people like Bayard Rustin, Stan Levison, Ella Baker, coming down and saying, we can show you the way to do this again, to take it to cities all over the country, to spread this message. But it didn't work for a long time. And it's important to remember that there was no blueprint for this, and King suffered extraordinary doubts about whether he was doing the right thing. Many times in his letters to his family and to his college professors, he said, people expect me to keep pulling rabbits out of my hat. He didn't know exactly why it worked in Montgomery, and when he went and tried again to duplicate the success that they had in places like St. Augustine and Albany, Georgia, it failed. The communities there did not respond. They were not able to put the kind of pressure, they were not able to exact the kind of demands that they sought and that they achieved in Montgomery. And even in Montgomery, what happened after King left? We think of the Montgomery bus boycott as being a great success, and it was. The buses were integrated. But after King left, the people who remained behind decided that the next step was going to be to integrate the city parks. And the city said, no, it's not. We're not going to play games this time. And they shut down all the city parks. They closed the zoo. They closed a park designed by Frederick Holmes, thank you, Olmsted, right, which was one of the jewels of the South. They sold off all the zoo animals, because they said we would rather have no parks in the city than have integrated parks. And that was the backlash that King faced everywhere he went. These cities were determined not to let this happen again. And it's not until really more than half a decade later that he starts to have success in places like Birmingham and in Selma. And here we see him at the March on Washington. And of course, this, I would argue, is the peak moment of his career. It's the moment that everybody's familiar with. I Have a Dream, the speech he gave that day. But this is also part of the problem I have with how we tell the King story. We focus on I Have a Dream. We focus on the part of the speech that is the most moving, that feels the most comfortable to us, that we should all be judged by the content of our character, that we look forward to the day that our children will hold hands and race won't be a factor in their relationships. And we forget that the first half of the speech, the part that he actually wrote, was an attack on American democracy, that it was an attack on capitalism, that it was an attack on police brutality. We forget, we need to teach the first half of that speech as much, if not more, than we teach the second half about I Have a Dream. But once again, so King comes here on August 28th, 1963, and gives the speech that I think gets us closer than we've ever been as an American society to putting racism behind us, or at least dealing with it in a way that shows respect for everybody, that acknowledges the horrors of the past. After that day, even conservatives, even many white preachers in the South are saying, it's time for us to turn a new leaf. It's time for us to try to do things differently. I interviewed people who told me that they went home from that, they watched that speech on television and went to work the next day and talked to their bosses about integrating the offices, integrating the factory floors. I interviewed a man who was married to a black woman and would never wear his wedding ring and never put a picture of her on the desk because he didn't want his office workers to know about his interracial marriage. But that after the March on Washington, he put on his wedding ring and put a picture of his wife on the desk. It had that, it seemed to offer this moment of hope. And I think it was palpable. I think that we saw this vision of black and white kids on the lawn holding hands and singing in harmony, literally, and that hope didn't last, I'm sorry to say, because what happened just days later, the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, and what happened the very next day after the March on Washington, the FBI produces a memo that says, in response to King's demagogic speech yesterday, we must view him as the greatest threat in America right now. The American government, our top law enforcement agency, decides that he's a threat. We should pause and think about that for a while. Why is that? Now, some members of the FBI were concerned that he might have been associating with members of the Communist Party, former members of the Communist Party mostly. But there were former communists everywhere in American society at that time, in most major newsrooms, even in the halls of Congress and probably in the White House. It was not uncommon. And the FBI authorized wiretaps on King's home and on his office because they believed that he might be under the influence of communists. Very quickly became clear that King and his colleagues, including former members of the Communist Party like Stan Leveson and Bayard Rustin, were not talking about communism at all. They were talking about American democracy and how it could be made better and how it could be made more complete. And there was nothing remotely unpatriotic. And King said it over and over when he was asked about these allegations. He said, "We are the best friends of American democracy. We, the people who've been treated worst by this country, are out there risking our lives, suffering, to make this country better, to make it live up to its promise." The communists want to see racial strife. They want to prove that the American system is not working. We are trying to make it work. But it didn't matter. And even after the FBI acknowledged that they were not hearing anything related to communism on these tapes, the surveillance continued. In fact, it doubled down, and they began planting wiretaps, planting listening devices in King's hotel rooms. Why? Because they had heard him with women. Because they had heard him talking to women who were not Coretta. And they began to become obsessed with that. And again, we should pause and ask why. Why is that a matter of importance to the federal government? Why is that a matter of importance to our top law enforcement agents? One answer is that they were racist. And J. Edgar Hoover made that quite clear, and we can hear his own remarks. We know some of the things he called King. But I think that it goes deeper than that. I think that what's at stake here, and in this way, J. Edgar Hoover might be right, he sees that King has this unique ability to inspire the masses, black and white, rich and poor, to fundamentally change American society. And that's exactly what J. Edgar Hoover fears the most. The white power structure as it stands in 1963 has been very good to J. Edgar Hoover and to most of the people in power, and they're determined to keep it that way. And that's why King becomes a target. King is warned that the FBI is onto him. He's warned that he should cut ties with people like Stan Leveson and Bayard Rustin. His own advisors are telling him, you should try to just stick to what you're good at, stick to voting rights in the South, because we need to be friends. We need to stay on good terms with President Johnson. And King, he doesn't listen. And I think it's because he's not a politician. And I love this picture of him with LBJ, because these are two men that do not understand each other. Martin Luther King can't understand why politicians, including LBJ, don't do the right thing. Why they don't do the moral thing. Don't they know that war is wrong? Don't they know that poverty and inequality are wrong? Don't they know? LBJ seems to know. He's promoting and helping to pass this important civil rights legislation, some of the most important legislation ever written in American history. Why doesn't he understand the morality involved? And LBJ doesn't understand why King doesn't play politics, why he's not more Machiavellian. And there's this just great disconnect. And I think what they don't understand is that they're just different animals in that way. They're different beasts. And so King, when he has the opportunity to do the safe thing, never does. He knows he's under surveillance. He knows that his cries against Northern racism are hurting the funding of his organization. And he knows that his criticism of the Vietnam War is damaging his relationship with LBJ. Now, I want to talk about one other archival find that I made in this book. I was very fortunate to find things like the personal archivist for MLK, L.D. Reddick, his papers at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, thousands of pages of every meeting for King and the SCLC. But I think maybe the most important discovery that I made was in the papers belonging to LBJ's secretary, Mildred Stiegel. And it was David Garrow, another biographer, who said, have you ever thought about checking LBJ's secretary's files? And they had not been opened yet. They had not been declassified, but I was able to request their declassification. And what they showed was that LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover were in constant communication, sometimes 2-3 times a week, discussing Martin Luther King. And it was not, as I said, not an issue of national security. It had become a personal obsession. And King knew this, understood it, and yet continued to stand up for what he believed in. So when he's under attack, when he's getting damaged so severely by the white press, and in particular, it's worth remembering, so LBJ has these tapes, and J. Edgar Hoover is sending him these tapes of King's telephone conversations with women, his hotel room exploits with women. He's sending these, and sending transcripts and the actual tapes to White House staff, to LBJ, to members of the media. And the media likes to pat itself on the back for not reporting on King's extramarital affairs, but what we forget sometimes is that they could have reported on the FBI's surveillance of King and didn't. And what we forget sometimes also is that these reporters who were covering King, these editorial writers who were writing about King and criticizing him for speaking out against Northern racism, criticizing him for attacking the Vietnam War, they knew about these tapes. And it had tainted their view of King. It had so tainted the press coverage. It tainted King's ability to be effective in his work. And it personally damaged King. It damaged him emotionally. He was hospitalized numerous times for what they called exhaustion back then, but Coretta and others referred to as depression. We forget that when he got news of the Nobel Peace Prize, he was in the hospital at the time for one of these bouts of exhaustion and needed sleeping pills to get to sleep. And when the phone rang with the news that he'd won the Nobel Prize, he didn't know if he was dreaming or not. And yet he invites reporters to come to his bedside in the hospital where he's being treated for depression and to talk to them there. This is how difficult the man's life was. And yet he keeps going. He keeps doubling down. Every time he could step back, every time he could cut his losses, every time he could take the safe way out, he could just restrict himself to voting rights. He could take a year off and write a book. He could decide that it's time to let the younger activists take over and he's going to teach. He's going to be a mentor. But he never does. And in fact, he doubles down. What does he do? He comes to Chicago. He moves here in 1966 to North Lawndale and says he's going to stay there until the city agrees to a series of profound changes in housing, in education. He offers a concrete blueprint on how the city can overcome some of its segregation. And of course, he marches through Gage Park and Marquette Park and is treated worse than he's been treated, he says, than even in Birmingham and Selma. He's hit in the head with a rock. There's taunts of all kinds, using the worst imaginable language. There are Nazis carrying Nazi flags. And yet, what does he do? He continues to negotiate until Mayor Daley agrees to a set of reforms. And then as soon as King leaves town, Daley ignores the reforms. We're still living today here, all of us in Chicago, with the consequences of that. But King was not giving up. What did he do after that? He went down to Mississippi and marched with James Meredith. Stokely Carmichael is calling him out for being too conservative. And so even King is now getting it from both sides. From the white people who think he's too radical, from the black people who think he's too conservative, and he's doubling down. So he begins speaking out more aggressively on the Vietnam War. He begins planning the Poor People's Campaign, as he calls it. He says that it's not enough anymore to fight for civil rights. We have to fight for human rights. And he begins planning basically what you might call Occupy Washington, D.C. He's going to bring thousands of people to the mall in Washington, and they're going to live there until America introduces serious economic reforms that will guarantee jobs and housing and fair and at least a minimum salary for everyone in America. The courage just boggles my mind, and it was exhausting. Toward those last years of his life, people like Andrew Young, pictured in this photo, said they thought King needed help. They thought he needed a year off, that they were encouraging him to see a psychiatrist, but he was afraid to even see a psychiatrist because if the FBI found out, he worried what they would do with that information. So as he's planning the Poor People's Campaign, and it's not going well, he's having trouble recruiting. Members of his own staff are in rebellion. He's having a hard time holding the organization together. Funding is down. As he's planning for this, just months away, he's asked to come to Memphis, 1968. His good friend James Lawson, who I spoke to on the phone so often, begged him to come because the sanitation workers were striking and they needed somebody to fight for them. And once again, King's advisors said, no, you've got bigger things to do. This is just a local labor issue. You don't need to get involved. But King saw this again as part of his charge, part of his mission, rooted in the Bible, that we stand up for the little person. We stand up for the underdog. We fight for the truth, regardless of when and where it may or may not be convenient. So he goes to Memphis. And the first time he goes, there's a violent outbreak during his march, and he's determined to try again, because as a nonviolent activist, he's humiliated by what's happened. He feels terrible. So he goes back to Memphis. And now the Poor People's Campaign is just weeks away. And yet again, they're begging him not to go. And what happens when he gets to Memphis? We all know, unfortunately. He speaks the last sermon of his life, the last speech of his life, and says to this audience of thousands of people, he didn't want to go that night. He wasn't feeling well. Ralph Abernathy went in his place, and Ralph Abernathy gets there. It's pouring rain. Thousands of people have come out to hear Dr. King. And Abernathy calls King back at the Lorraine Motel and says, they really don't want to hear me, Doc. They want you. So King gets out of bed, dresses, makes his way through the rain, and gives this speech that gives me goosebumps just to think about it. And of course, we know the last refrain where he says, I would like to live a long life. There's merit in longevity. But what happens to me now doesn't matter. Because I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I know that we as a people will reach the promised land. And a lot of people thought that he was prophesizing his own death that night. A lot of people thought that he knew something was coming. I don't believe that. I don't believe that because I think he had too many plans, and he had too much that he still wanted to get done. And I have no doubt that he was suffering emotionally, that he was full of doubt, that he was exhausted at times. But the next day at the Lorraine Motel, as he's planning for this march, he's out on the balcony getting dressed for dinner. They're going to dinner at the home of one of his friends in Memphis. And he's joking with the people down in the parking lot. He's talking to this performer who's going to be playing that night as a fundraiser for the march, and asks him to play one of his favorite hymns. He jokes with Jesse Jackson about what they're eating that night for dinner. And his driver, King's driver, calls up to him and says, it's getting a little cold, Doc. You might want to go back in and get a jacket. And King says, okay, I will. And as he's turning to go back in and get a jacket, he's struck in the face by a bullet. And he died almost instantly. Now, it's tempting, I think, to think of King as a saint, as someone whose only concern was improving the world, to bringing us closer together as a people. But that's not who King was. He was a human being. He was flesh and blood. And the saints were flesh and blood too. The Christian saints were people who had doubts, people who had failures, people who yelled at God. But they become saints because they're committed, because they never give up. And despite their weaknesses, they try to live in the example of Jesus Christ. And a saint inspires us to try to shape our lives. And that's what King did. So I wrote this book to try to humanize King, to make us see that our heroes don't have to be perfect, that they can't be perfect, and that we can't really expect anyone to be a hero, to step up and try to lead if we demand perfection. I also wrote this book to point out some of the parallels between racial justice in the United States in the 50s and 60s and today. And I wrote this book because Dr. King said that we must remain awake to change, that we must never lose hope, and that we must continue to work for equal rights and for justice. And I wrote this book because I hope that we will all carry King's message forward and say to ourselves what King said in his final words. Okay, I will. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would love to have a discussion with you, take questions, and hang out afterwards, but please use the microphone for your questions so everybody can hear. Don't be shy. It's always the coolest person who asks the first question. There we go.
Hi, Jonathan. Oh, is this on?
It's on.
I heard a speech by King a year before he died, to the day.
Oh, wow.
Do you know the speech I'm talking about? He was talking about addressing poverty.
Oh,
and-
well, the speech he gave on...
like almost a year.
It was exactly
a
Riverside
year,
Church.
Yeah.
It's my favorite speech, actually, of King's. It's called Beyond Vietnam. And that was a speech at Riverside Church in New York where he was the most outspoken and most really vicious in his attacks on the American government. He said that, and he really summed up his entire philosophy in that speech, which is why it's my favorite. Everything from, his childhood lessons from Bible school to the day of that speech comes together in that speech. Even though he didn't actually write it, Vincent Harding wrote it, and King read it just moments before he went on stage. But it's still my favorite King speech because, hey, President Vincent Harding. But presidents don't write their own speeches either, so I'm okay with that. But what I love about that speech is that he basically says that I can't, in good conscience, criticize the violent outbreaks in Los Angeles or Detroit without pointing out that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth today is the American government operating in Vietnam. And he was blasted the next day in the press for that speech. Every major newspaper in America virtually called him out, said he was a fool, said he didn't understand international affairs, never mind that he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And we hear King on the phone the next day, actually, with one of his closest advisors, Stan Leveson, one of his closest friends. And Leveson saying, I didn't like that speech. It didn't sound like you. It's going to set us back. And we know this because the FBI was wiretapping the phones, and we have a transcript of the conversation. And your heart just goes out to King because he says, don't you know me? Haven't you been listening to anything I've been saying all these years? It might have been politically unwise for me to say those things, but it was not morally unwise.
Thank you for the journey you took us on. I just wanted to mention that my wife and I went down to Memphis, went to the Civil Rights Museum, etc. And one of the things that struck us about being in the footsteps, so to speak, is how humanizing it is to be there. You have this sense of the grand journey, which indeed it was, but it's so local, and it's so just in your face. It's just, here's a diner, here's across the street from where the assassin was stationed. So I just wanted to highly recommend a journey to that place because it is eye-opening.
I agree, and there are many historical places where you can really get a good feel for King. And I'm not a huge fan of the monument in Washington. That I wouldn't put that on my top 5 list. But the parsonage in Montgomery is extraordinary because it's so small and modest. And the home in Atlanta, where he grew up, really, his sister helped to decorate the home after it was turned into a national monument. And she went through old Sears catalogs and found furniture that she thought looked like what they had back then. And it really looks a lot like what it did at the time the Kings were living there. So those places where you can literally walk in his footsteps, you can stand at the window that King jumped from twice when he was 12 years old and trying to hurt himself. Those are just incredibly powerful experiences. I recommend you check those things out.
Great. I have a two-part question. If King were alive today, what would he be working on? Inequality in income, voter rights, the climate, political divisiveness, and would he be effective?
Wow. I don't know if he'd be effective. That's a great question. If he'd lived maybe the world would be a little different and we wouldn't be so divided today. Who knows? I'd like to think so. But, you know, the good thing about King is that he pretty much told us, you know, when people ask me what would he say today, I feel I am in no position to attempt to guess because he existed on a level that I can't comprehend. But he left us his words that really speak to today because, as I said earlier, look at the I Have a Dream speech. Look at the first half of it. I wish we would just change the name of the I Have a Dream speech because in the first half he talks about police brutality. He talks about reparations. He talks about economic inequality, the things that are still troubling us today, the things that are proving to be so persistent. And the other thing I would say is that when King was assassinated and this country went up in flames, we had a choice about how we responded to that moment. And we chose to respond to it with law enforcement, as opposed to enacting some of the measures that King had been fighting for. And we're still living with the consequences of that today. So I think King that would still be fighting the same fight.
When King lived in North Lawndale, was he aware of the widespread practice of contract buying, where if a family missed a payment, they could be evicted and the apartment sold over and over again?
I think he was pretty well aware. He had a good team of lawyers that were working with him, and they were really trying to create an organized protest in which people would refuse to pay their rent if the landlords did not meet the conditions that they considered livable. On the broader sense, I've been told by many people who knew King, who were here in Chicago at the time, that they didn't think he really fully understood the complications of Chicago politics, that he was not really well prepared for just how divided some of the black community would be, how many people would remain loyal to Mayor Daley, and I don't think he understood just how uncooperative Daley was going to be. But nevertheless, you know, he stuck to what he believed in, and I think that part of why he did these things, the same thing is true in Birmingham, you know, or anywhere else he goes, is he sees himself as a lightning rod, that he can call attention to these problems. So even if he doesn't solve them, even if he doesn't have an exact plan, he's going to call enough attention to it that he's going to make the nation start to deal with it. And that's why we get the Civil Rights Act. That's why we get the Voting Rights Act. And he also thought that was how we would get the Fair Housing Act, which didn't happen, but at least didn't happen until after he was assassinated. But I think he felt like even if things in Chicago weren't planned to the T, he would raise enough attention, call enough attention to the conditions that things would change.
I also have a two-part question. The first is regarding a speech that King gave at the Edgewater Beach Hotel on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. I worked on a project involving that, and I couldn't find very much detailed information about it. I'm wondering if you know much about that particular speech. And then secondly, is all the FBI material on King declassified now? I believe when Reagan announced the national holiday, they said they would keep a lot of it under lock and key, maybe extra long. I'm just wondering what's the status of all that.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that speech, but if you get back to me, I can look it up and see if I have anything in my files on it. As for the FBI documents, a lot of the transcripts have been declassified, and Donald Trump did me a favor. One of the few things that I appreciated about Trump's administration is that he, I think, accidentally declassified thousands of more pages of King's materials. He was intending to declassify. He took it, right. He accidentally took it to the bathroom at Mar-a-Lago and declassified it. No, he declassified a lot of the JFK assassination papers, and and when doing so, the King papers were declassified along with them because they were part of the same congressional committees that were investigating it. So thousands of pages were released just in the last 3 years. But we do not have yet is the actual tapes. The audio recordings are set to be released in 2027, and that will be interesting to see what else is on those tapes that the FBI didn't tell us about. But I'll have to get back to you on that.
I'm curious about the FBI surveillance also. In particular, did you look into like how widespread was it throughout the FBI organization? And would those agents have had a sense that what they were doing was potential, shameful in the light of history, or would they have seen it as, doing their job, or, yeah?
I think for the most part, they saw it as doing their job. Nobody blew the whistle. Nobody recognized. They lived in fear of J. Edgar Hoover, and we see this in the memos quite clearly. There's one memo written soon, right around the time of the March on Washington, where the agent says he's clearly not a threat. And Hoover writes back and says, that's what we said about Castro, too. And how did that turn out? And then the next day, there's another memo saying, the director is right. We can't take this for granted. King must still be viewed as a threat. So up and down the line, and to answer your question, there were dozens of people high up in the FBI who knew what was going on and participated in it. The FBI sent a sort of greatest hits selection from the tapes to King's home, hoping that Coretta would hear it, hoping that it would destroy their marriage. And there were many people involved in making that tape and sending it to their home. Bobby Kennedy almost certainly knew about the tapes and almost certainly heard them, but I don't know for sure. But it was Kennedy who initially authorized the wiretaps, or RFK signed the authorization for the wiretaps and signed for them to be renewed, because the Attorney General is supposed to check, I can't remember if it's every 90 days, demand proof that the wiretaps should continue, and Kennedy signed off on that over and over again.
Hi, Jonathan. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about Mahalia Jackson from Chicago.
Yes.
I had heard, correct me if I'm wrong, I had heard that Dr. King had given variations of the I Have a Dream speech. It wasn't the first time.
That's true.
On the Mall, he would kind of test it out at other venues. And Mahalia Jackson, who I think was his favorite singer, had heard it several times. And I think he began to falter a little bit, getting in the weeds of the police brutality, all that, the part one of that speech on the Mall. And I had heard that she said, Mahalia Jackson said, I think she was sitting in front of him, or she said, Martin, tell him about the dream, kind of to get him focused.
Yeah.
Is there any
So
truth to that?
you're batting 3 for 4. He loved Mahalia's singing. He would call her sometimes just when he was feeling low and ask her to sing over the phone. He also loved her cooking. I think she might have been his favorite cook. Juanita Abernathy, close behind. And yes, he did give that speech at least 2 or 3 times prior to the March on Washington, but no, Mahalia did not spark it. And that's been a myth. It's a myth that I've been trying to bust, because it's published in many books. I think Taylor Branch has it in his book. Many others have repeated it. And the story goes that King was sort of sputtering, as you said, and then Mahalia called out, tell him about the dream, as if to say, hey, ditch the rest of your speech and do the dream thing instead. And that's not what happened. Okay. So King did have a written speech that day. He got to the end, and then he began to give the I Have a Dream speech. He just decided, because I'm Martin Luther King Jr., that I'm not done yet. My time may be up, but I'm not done yet. And now it's time to go to church. And if you watch the video, he's reading the speech all up until he pauses and says, and today I have a dream. And then he goes into the dream speech, which he's given before, and he never looks down at his notes again, because he's giving this from the heart. He's giving it the way he speaks in church. He says, it's time for a sermon, and I'm going to take you to church now. And after he says, I have a dream for the 3rd or 4th time, and I got the master recording from Motown, and you can hear Mahalia after the 3rd or 4th dream reference say, tell him about the dream, Martin. So it's not tell him about the dream, Martin. It's tell him about the dream, Martin. It's encouragement. She's echoing him. And some reporter just moved it around a little bit, embellished it a little bit, give Mahalia more credit. But Mahalia never took credit for it. She never mentioned it in her memoir. She writes about that day and doesn't take any credit and doesn't make any mention of the shift in the speech. So I think King gets all the credit.
Okay, I just wanted to add, on YouTube you can watch Mahalia Jackson singing prior. She was like the opening act, I
Right.
think. And if you, I mean, she rocks the house. It's unbelievable.
Yes, she always does.
Thank you.
I was just curious to know how you approached the King family with the idea of writing the book, and were they cooperative or were they hesitant at first?
Great question. I approached them early on and never got a response. I wrote them many letters. I called. I went through intermediaries, and then I spoke to the family lawyer, and he said they would not be participating in the book. When I finished the book, I sent them a draft and asked them if they would reconsider. I'd still like to interview them. I asked them for permission to use, old family photos, and they said no. So I did speak to many nephews and nieces and cousins, and the kids decided not to participate, which I regret. I hope maybe someday they'll read the book, and I'd love to hear from them if they do.
Doesn't the family also claim rights to the words?
Yes, the family has the copyright on all of King's speeches. Well, if there are any lawyers in the room, fair use allows you a certain amount that you can quote from legally, and beyond that, if you want to use more than the legal limit, you need to get written permission and pay for the right to use the additional material. I offered to pay, and they said no, so I then just decided to use only the limited amount that I needed. So I had to rewrite some of the I Have a Dream speech. I think my version's better. Check it out. Right. Yes.
Two questions, if you don't mind. The first one is, I've been staring up at this picture for 10, 15 minutes now. Any idea who that little boy is on King's elbow?
No, I wish I knew. I'd love to be able to tell you that he grew up to be, I don't know, Barack Obama, but I don't think the boy's ever been identified. I know the photographer. I can't think of his name at the moment, but I love that picture.
Yeah, it's very striking. But my real question is, what comes next? Who's the next person you're thinking about? What topic are you thinking about? What's? I know you spent so many years writing this book, but
yeah,
you got to have some idea of what comes.
I have some ideas, but it's a 6-year. This is a 6-year project, and when you're diving into something for that long, you got to be careful before you dive in. So I'm taking my time, and I'm enjoying this book for as long as I can. But I have a couple of ideas, and I hope soon I might be able to announce it. Thank you for asking.
Please keep them coming.
I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Thanks so much.
I'm going to ask one more question because I can.
Okay.
You said you got that autobiography of King Sr. that no one else had ever discovered. How did the family not even know about it? How did you come across it? There's got to be a story there.
All right. So Daddy King published an autobiography in the 70s, and I hired a genealogist to help me track down the King ancestry, and the genealogist found a mention in somebody's family tree of a Daddy King autobiography that was written 7 years earlier than the published autobiography. So I began searching for it. I called the King Center in Atlanta. They didn't know where it was. I called the King Research Library at Stanford, and they didn't know where it was. And I finally said to them, I think you have it. It's just not in your it's not in your system, like it's not in your card catalog, but I'm pretty sure you have it. And I convinced somebody there to go and dig through the files, and they did indeed have it. So it was sitting there, and nobody knew. And it was not just the unpublished autobiography; it was also the interviews that he did with his ghostwriter. So I had the transcripts of these interviews as well as the written biography, and I'm hoping maybe someday the family will publish it because it's a great addition. It's it's written 7 years earlier than the other book he did, so the memories are fresher. So I think it's a really important discovery.
How many other King biographies are there, and did you hesitate?
Well, King, like Abraham Lincoln, is one of our most important figures, and there have been hundreds of books written about him. But the last biography, and we can discuss whether I don't call Taylor Branch's trilogy a biography. Taylor Branch doesn't call it a biography. David Garrow's book, Bearing the Cross, is not a biography either, and David Garrow would say the same thing. In fact, I've asked him, do you consider biography? He said no. The last biography was Let the Trumpets Sound by Stephen Oates, and that was 1981, I believe. So that's 42 years ago. So we can't go 42 years without a biography of King. We need a new King biography for every generation at least. So, and I think the big difference between my book and Garrow and Branch is that those are books that tell the story of the civil rights movement with a lot of King mixed in. And I wanted to tell the story of King with a lot of civil rights mixed in. I wanted to just shift the focus so that we see the human more clearly. And that was really, what I thought was, an important distinction.
Great, all right. Well, I'll hold the rest of my questions till the after party. I want to invite everyone who's here to join us at the Plymouth Rooftop Grill. It's just a half a block north of the library. So Plymouth is the street on the west side of the library. Just go up half a block, and we'll gather. You're going to be able to join us for a while. We'll gather there for some free appetizers and a cash bar, and everyone is welcome to join us. So with that, I want to again thank John for such a great program, and we at the Midland Authors have a little something for you. It's extension of your membership for 1 year. So,
Thank you.
plus your very own Midland Authors coffee mug.
Thank you so much.
So use it wisely. Thank you so much. Books are for sale, and Jonathan will be right down here. You'll line up, please, and Jennifer will take it from there. Thank you.